Hello everybody, we're just waiting for a few members to come and join us and then we'll get started with the introductions. We'll start dead on for the 2 p.m. time slot, 2 minutes time. Perfect, I can see it starting to fill up. We'll be starting in 1 minute time, guys. Right, it's just about to hit the deadline. So welcome everybody to the This Can Happen webinar for self-care in an unstable world. Your host today will be Lindsay Metcalf, who I'll just be handing you over to in a few moments. The meeting will be recorded and there is also slides as well, and these will both be sent to yourself once the presentation is finished. There is a chat box available for yourselves and a Q&A box if you wanted to put any questions in throughout the process. We will try and answer as many as possible throughout, obviously at the end. There is also going to be a couple of polls, so they'll be sent through and come up onto your screen. If you just answer them, we'll share the results afterwards and discuss and go through those results during the presentation as well. I do hope everybody enjoys the session and thank you very much for joining. I'll hand you over to Lindsay now.
Okay, hello everybody and good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are in the world. Hopefully you can hear me okay and see everything. Let me just start by introducing myself. I started out my life in industry working in management consultancy, really high pressure, long hours, lots and lots of stress. And then about 10 years ago, I actually retrained in health and well-being. I became very burnt out and I wanted to understand how to actually help people with this stuff, because I think certainly 25 years ago when I started my career, nobody talked about this. Whereas now, at least we're all here talking about how we can take care of ourselves in a difficult world. And I now work with people as a one-on-one coach and also with corporates about how we can make positive changes in our lives, how we can come together to actually deal with the challenges modern life throws at us. I sit as a board member of the Complementary Natural Healthcare Council, and I'm qualified in several mind-body disciplines. So that's the space that I work in. When it comes to this dealing with an unstable world, this came out of the last couple of years in that I personally had some really big challenges that I had absolutely no control over. And that was within the context of a global pandemic and everything else that was going on. So I had to radically draw on all of my experience and skills to come together and try and figure out how on earth we deal with this stuff. So that's what we're talking about today. We are going to be talking about stuff we can't control, in essence. So when we have uncertainty, when we have instability in our lives, how can we be resilient? How can we personally put in place things so we don't get overwhelmed and don't get anxious? And as Zach said, there's going to be a couple of polls today, so please do get involved in those. I want to hear from you. We've got a lot of material to cover today. There's a lot of questions that have come through before the webinar. I would love to take questions as we go through as well, so please do feed those through on the chat box, and Zach will pass them on to me because I want to get through as much as possible. I want this to be interactive. I don't just want to sit here and talk at you for the next hour. So this is what we're talking about, how to deal with an unstable world and an uncertain world as well. And I think I'd like to just take a moment to acknowledge that the last few years have been really, really tough. Over and above all of the normal day-to-day stresses that we have, when one challenge has kind of started to fade, another one seems to come in, and there's been half a dozen big global things that have happened. And whether we're personally involved or not, or whether people we care about are personally involved or not, they can take a huge toll. Now, for humanity, the world has always been challenging. There's always been difficult things that happen. But here in the 21st century, it's piped into our houses 24/7. It's in the workplace. We operate as a global community, essentially. We've been coming together more as a human race over the last 100 years, perhaps. So if with that visibility comes perhaps that feeling of being more helpless with large events that are taking place. And what I see with a lot of people I work with, a lot of my clients, we're becoming more reactionary because it gets harder and harder because we get that overwhelming stimulus all the time. So today is about taking a step back and saying, right, what personal accountability can we take for our own well-being in the face of all of this uncertainty? And what I'd like to do before I go into that is actually talk a bit about how we are hardwired, because I think it's really important to understand the neurology behind this and why we react to uncertain events and instability. Now, if you think back even, say, 3,000 or 4,000 years, or even 300 or 400 years, things were more predictable. But if we go back to how we evolved several thousand years ago, the world of early man was actually relatively predictable. It might be dangerous at times. There might be a sudden snowstorm, there might be an earthquake, there might be a lion hiding around the corner. But the seasons were predictable. We knew when the sun was going to shine. We knew when the rains would come, when the snows would come. We could plan. So we were very in tune with what was happening on a sort of global basis in a way to our environment. We understood the threats, we understood the rewards that came with that. But what's happened in the modern era, and especially I would say over the last 100 to 200 years, and especially in the last 10 or 20 years, the pace of change is increasing exponentially. Even 20 years ago, the idea that we would be sitting here now with the sorts of technology that we have would be almost unthinkable. And it's worth seeing that as that exponential change curve has gone up, basically, we haven't evolved as human beings to deal with that pace of change. So we become increasingly unsettled. We see a rise in anxiety and depression because the instinctive habitual control mechanisms that our minds and bodies have aren't necessarily going to cut it in a world that is much more reactionary, much more visible, where we have a lot more going on, where the pace of change is increasing. So if you are finding yourself becoming overwhelmed by things that you see externally, by events in the news, by whatever's happening in the world, whether it be pandemics, wars, poverty, injustice, bear in mind that those instinctive feelings, responses that we have, well, we need to take more of a step back. We have to take more of a conscious, reasoned approach. And someone once actually put it beautifully when they said we're at a stage in humanity where we need to kick our thinking up the evolutionary ladder a gear because it's not working anymore. So this is the space that I'm talking about, is actually let's get us operating more effectively. So before we go into talking about how we personally can deal with all of this stuff, I just want to take a moment to have a look at how our brain deals with an uncertain world and instability and things we can't control. Now, I'm sure you're all aware of the fight or flight response. But where this comes from in the brain is the emotion center, which is effectively called the limbic system. It governs our behavioral and emotional responses. And there's a really small piece of that called the amygdala. And the amygdala is responsible for a very primal fight or flight response. And it sends the message to produce things like cortisol, adrenaline, those hormones that make us feel sick, they make us feel anxious and worried. Now, the limbic system itself cannot differentiate between an actual threat, a perceived threat, a threat that is perhaps an injury, or a threat that is panic over a deadline, or something really big, so worrying about the safety of a loved one. It doesn't really distinguish between those. It just triggers off this fight or flight response. And we're totally hardwired to survive in a particular way and to react in a particular way. Now, as we've evolved as a human being, our neocortex, our more rational side of the brain, has actually evolved to almost calm. I mean, I'm talking in lay terms here, but this is how it works, is it calms the amygdala down. It says, actually, this isn't a real issue. It's okay, you can calm down. Or actually, this is a very valid response. And then it provides a reasoned response to what that threat or stimulus is. Unfortunately, what happens when we are dealing with instability, uncertainty, stress, worry over time, is it actually weakens that connection in the system. It weakens the connection between the neocortex, the cerebral cortex, and the limbic system. So our limbic system responses are almost going haywire a little bit, and it actually causes structure changes in the brain. So you have to do some serious work to create those neural networks again. So it's not just a case of saying, oh, I don't need to worry about this, let's suppress it, let's sit back, I'm not going to deal with that. What you can actually do is try and increase those neural pathways so that you can manage the primal responses more successfully, essentially. It's called basic neuroplasticity, which is that ability of the brain to adapt. Years ago, we didn't think that the brain was at all neuroplastic. We thought by a certain age that it was set. But we now know that throughout our lives, we can create new pathways. And looking after yourself and self-care when things are worrying, when things are stressful, actually is about ensuring that those pathways are healthy and that they're doing their job and they're able to do their job properly. So that's what's actually happening at a sort of mind and physical level. I want to actually take a check-in here. And I've called this slide, Ask Yourself, Are You Overreacting? Now, this isn't a judgment of these are bad responses. It's simply if you find yourself checking a lot of these, it is likely that your response to whatever is happening, unless it's an immediate danger, I'm not diminishing something where you are in immediate physical danger. But if these are things that you are ticking against regularly, then it's possible that your reaction has become overstimulated and action is required. So we're going to go straight in at this point to our first poll. So Zach, could I hand over to you, please, to run the first poll?
Of course you can. I'll just be going through to everybody in a moment. So how many of these do you experience? None, up to 4, 5 to 8, 9 to 12, or more than 13 of them?
And there's 15 on the screen, so don't overthink it. It's one of those gut reactions. Add up a few and let us know so we can get a feel of the type of things that you're thinking about on the call and your reactions. And while you're doing the poll, Zach, have we got any immediate questions that are coming through that I could take?
Yes, I have. There's been 2 that have come on to the. There we go. It says, do you have any advice for the best way to engage in short-term strategies for self-care while also pushing to change the broader workplace culture towards a better model?
Oh, that's such a great question. Hold that space on the self-care things, because actually I've got a checkpoint list we're going to go through in a minute, which has, it's got about 9 items on, but there's 2 or 3 in there which are everyday practices that will immediately make a difference. In terms of cultural change within organisations, that's a whole bigger piece in its own right. But what I would say is at a senior level, I think there's a huge amount of leading by example and creating the culture where it's okay to talk about this stuff. Because the worst thing is when we suppress it, we sit on it and we feel like we're alone. So encouraging that, leading by example, making sure that there's a safe space, an area for people to speak out, I think is really important. Thank you for that question. Zach, have we got some results coming through of the poll? I know we've got a lot of people online today, so it might take a little bit longer.
Yeah, we've got about a 70% response ratio at the moment, so I'm happy to end it now if you like.
I think that's a great idea. Let's get some results coming through and see what we've got.
Perfect, so that's just being shared now. So it did say about 3% said that they experienced none of those, 43% said that they experienced up to 4, so that's where most of our responses are sort of coming. 5 to 8 we had 40%, 9 to 12 we had 12%, and more than 13 there was only 2%.
Okay, thank you ever so much for sharing that. I think that's it's what I would expect. It's the standard, you know, bell curve distribution. But isn't it worrying that we all experience more than a few of these? And these aren't helpful things. They make us feel bad, they make us feel sick, and they have a physical impact as well. So let's see what we can do about this. And that is the bulk of today's presentation and webinar. So I've called this Create Your Personal Plan for Dealing with an Unstable World. And I've got 9 points here. They are, we could talk about this stuff for several days. And, you know, when we've got an hour, it's let's put some things in and see what works. If you only go away from today with a couple of things that you think, I'm going to make those small changes today, they will make a difference. So I'm going to go straight into number 1. Actually, it's understanding what the problem is. This goes with this very reactionary response that many of us have. And I think the first thing is actually understanding how real this problem is. Because actually, your response to a threat might be very, very rational, might be a very real threat. It might be a real response to something where there is an uncertain outcome. And that's incredibly stressful. Human beings are not good with really uncertain outcomes. We operate best when, yes, we can problem solve and we can make decisions, but that we can see some form of end to something and have those boundaries. So even if the threat is rational, the response to it might be causing you a negative impact, so it needs to be addressed. Second point here is putting those fears in context. As I said earlier, the world has always been a difficult, unstable place. And that's not to diminish anything that's happening at the moment, but we are exposed to it all the time. And we can have it piped into our homes through the internet, through the television, through conversations, through the radio. It's there all the time. That is not a normal state of affairs for us as a psychophysical person, a mind-body union, so to speak. And we're going to react in a certain way to that. I would then suggest in this is actually doing some either journaling or what's called stream of consciousness writing to really understand what the problem is for you personally. Do you know you're over worrying, or is your worrying based on something rational? Is it one event that's causing you an issue, or is that general global instability that is the concern? Is it something more close to home? And I love stream of consciousness writing for that. It feels a little bit artificial at first, but you effectively set a timer for, say, 10 minutes. It doesn't need to be more than 5-10 minutes. And you either type or write without taking your pen off the page or without taking your hands off the keyboard for that period of time. And you just let whatever comes write. You don't stop, you don't think about it. So even if your mind is blank, you just write, I can't think of anything to write. I can't think of anything to write. And eventually things start to come out. And it taps into what really the heart of a problem generally is. Alongside this, be aware that for any mental response to something coming in, any form of stimulus, there's going to be a physical response as well. We can't divide the two. We can't separate the two. And you can't override your physical responses through willpower alone. So if you have that where you feel the stress is rising, you've got the pit in your stomach, you feel anxious, you're not sleeping. Had a lot of questions coming through about interrupted sleep, about those feelings of anxiety. Those are the chemicals in your body sending you a message that something is not right. And simply suppressing them is only going to send them the signals even stronger to you. So if you can, take a moment every day, or if you feel like that, to actually allow yourself to feel the feeling and breathe into it and try not to judge yourself for feeling it. So if the anxiety is rising, take a little bit of time, a couple of minutes, and say, it's okay to feel worried right now. I'm simply going to allow that feeling to come. I'm going to breathe deeply into it, and I'm going to allow it to pass. Saying that, there is always a time to recognize when it's important to get professional help. And that is when this is seriously impacting your daily life, or if people have commented they're worried about you, or if you're really suffering from sleep problems and so on, it's worth speaking to a professional, because some of the symptoms of over worrying, overreacting, stress, everyday burnout and worry can be also signs of more clinical depression and anxiety, which might require medication. So it's always worth just making sure you've had that checked out as well. So number one, understand what the problem is. Number two, understand what is actually in your circle of influence and what is in your circle of concern. Now, many of you may well have read Stephen Covey's 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. It's a classic in the sort of self-help sphere, but I like it. It's so simple. Where do you spend most of your time? I think it's worth going back to these first principles. If you are constantly in that circle of concern, you are going to be driving yourself crazy because you can't do anything about it. You are not in your circle of influence. And most of us have a significantly smaller circle of influence than circle of concern. If you're someone who is particularly prominent, a president or monarch or something like that, you may have a wider circle of influence than concern. But for most of us, we have a much smaller circle of influence than concern. So try and distinguish for any event, where are you actually operating? And try and focus your attention on the things that are within your circle of influence. It's such a basic point that I think we all know deep down, which is focus on the things that you can control and try and not get involved in the things you can't. But that's so hard to actually do when we're talking about big global events or something that somebody else is doing that we have absolutely no influence over whatsoever. But the key point here is, from a behavioral point of view, is actually telling yourself and using a mantra maybe even, which is, I'm in my circle of influence. This is what I can control. The thing I'm worried about is in my circle of concern. I cannot influence it. It is not something that I have control over. It may be something you decide to take action about. Some people just feel better when they're campaigning or donating or getting involved in something in that circle of concern. But that is not obligatory. You don't have to be doing that. It's more that understanding of where you are operating. Because it goes into the realms of, am I dwelling? Am I problem solving? Am I actually taking action? And sometimes this is something we have to be quite hard on ourselves about, in a way, because what happens if we're always in this circle of concern and getting really anxious? We start sending a message out to people who rely on us. And I'm thinking of children in particular, and I had quite a few questions through about how do I talk to children about difficult events, about what's happening in the world at the moment. And one of the main things is, yes, keep it simple, keep it factual, but again, lead by example. If they see you worried and anxious about something you can't control, they will also be worried and anxious. So think about where you are in those circles and the messages that you're actively sending out to others who depend on you. Zach, we're whistling through this stuff because we don't have much time, but can I just ask if we have any questions at this point?
Yes, of course, there are quite a couple in there actually. One of them is, do you have any suggestions for working through panic in relation to severe anxiety?
Okay, I'll take that one now before we go to the next one. Yes, this webinar is largely on general self-care for an unstable and insecure world. So I'm not going into too much detail around immediate crisis management. But if you do feel that you're having a panic attack or you feel the rising anxiety, there's two things I find enormously helpful. One of them is actually standing, cross your arms and say stop, stop, stop several times to break the connection. Or you can do it with breath. So big breath in and you take 3 or 4 big breaths out. So really fast. So you empty your lungs. And again, it breaks the rise of the stress hormones, because if you're in panic, being told to sit down and meditate is not helpful, because that's going to spiral everything out of control. So you almost need a quick movement which says stop and breathe to try and break that cycle. So and then take your big deep breaths to try and get some oxygen in. So that's the immediate thing to just break the cycle. There's a huge amount I could say about that, but that's just one quick tip to try and get out of that immediate panic mode. So thank you for that question. Zach, have we got another one at the moment?
Yes, we do. So long periods of isolation tend to make some people socially anxious. Do you have any ways to help reach out to your intimate circles?
Oh, that's such a lovely question, and it was something that came up a lot under COVID. And I think the first thing I'd say is be really kind to yourself. It's understandable that you feel that way, and it is really hard. Small steps at a time. I always like to work on the basis of the next best smallest step, and sometimes that might be simple as arranging a coffee or a Zoom call for a short period of time, or taking that one tiny step into doing something else. It doesn't have to be suddenly going out and going to the theatre or going to a concert or something. Try and do a couple of small things every few days to try and get back into the world a little bit again and reach out to people. And one thing I have found over the last few years is there really is an element of we're going through all of this together. People want to talk, they want to connect. So sometimes just taking that next best step, reconnect with someone you haven't spoken to for a while, and be honest. I've had a couple of people that I effectively lost contact with over COVID. We were all busy, we were all doing our own thing. And I reached out to them honestly and said, I'm so sorry I haven't been around. Things have been really tough, but I've been thinking about you and I just wanted to reach out and say hi. And that goes a long way. There's very few people who won't respond to that. So take that next best, smallest step. So thank you for those questions. We're going to carry on, because as I say, we've got a lot to cover and we've only got another 35 minutes. Before I leave this slide, on the subject of concern, influence, external factors that come in and stress us out, one of the things that someone said to me years ago, which I love and I use a lot, is when we're talking about people who stress us out, is saying to yourself, why do I allow someone to live rent-free in my head when I wouldn't even entertain them in my house? And it's such a nice one. When I often, I don't know if you ever had that thing where you get wound up with conversations in your head, you argue in your head, and by the time you even go to see somebody else, you're wound up because someone else maybe is doing something you have no influence over at all. And I always say to myself, why am I allowing this person to live rent-free in my head when I wouldn't even let them through my door? I wouldn't even make them a cup of tea or give them the time of day. So what am I doing to myself, allowing them to live with me all the time? And it just breaks that habit. Now I want to move on to number 3, which I think is really important given everything that is happening in the world at the moment. And again, I had quite a few questions coming through before the webinar, which were around, how do I protect myself from what is happening at the moment? The worry, the reading, the constant news about wars, about pandemics, about injustice, about the stuff that's happening. Well, we have control over that. We're not just mindless recipients of that. And it's worth remembering that constant exposure is simply not helpful. It stimulates the sympathetic nervous system, which is the part of the nervous system which sends everything up. And it's the bit that produces the stress hormones. So constant exposure is literally dripping stress hormones into the body 24/7. And this idea of doom scrolling, which I think it's a fabulous word, but also it says what it is that constant scrolling through the media. What's the next hit of the headline? What's the next awful thing? Because the media are really good at sending out personal interest stories. They tug at the heartstrings, and we want to read, we want to know what's going on. But ask yourself, what do I actually need to know? Is it important for me to have constant exposure? Some people's jobs, they may need to be working in that field and have that exposure. But for those of us who aren't, I always recommend taking a period every day, check the headlines, listen to the news, stay informed, and take news from different types of media, maybe the left-wing press and the right-wing press and the stuff in the middle, alternate it. Take your 15 minutes or your 10 minutes to understand that you're informed, and then stop. Only check it once a day, because that constant drip is fueling anxiety and fueling fear. And I know some of these are tough messages, but it's about choice as to how we expose ourselves to some of this information. And I see a lot of social media groups, WhatsApp, things on Reddit, on different forums, on Facebook. They fuel anxiety. We have this feed coming through to the computer in our hand, which is there all the time. And it's mute the notifications and check them once a day if you want to. But put yourself a plan of action in place for what you personally can take in terms of exposure to the media. Take ownership of it and have an alternative. It doesn't matter what it is. If it's a time you're tempted to scroll, you're tempted to stick on the 24/7 news on and have it in the background, do something else. Go for a walk, stroke the cat. That's usually my go-to. Anything but this constant drip. And what I'd like to do at this point is actually go to our second poll, because I'm really interested in how much time people spend looking at the media. So Zach, can I hand over to you for the second poll, please?
Yes, of course you can. I'm coming through for you in just a moment, everybody. So it's how much time do you currently spend every day watching the news, reading it online, or viewing it on social media? Please select one of the answers. It's none, a couple of minutes, under an hour, 1 to 2 hours, or over 2 hours every day. Just wait for those responses to start coming in.
Fantastic, thanks, Zach. Have we got a question that I can take while everyone's doing their answers?
Yes, there's actually a few that are in relation to anxiety that have kind of come through together. Let me just get to the right one. So some people find they're really anxious in the morning, or that they're waking up in the middle of the night with anxiety. Do you have any advice for morning routines that may help, or any tips for preventing them waking up in the middle of the night?
Okay, well, there's a reason that when we're anxious, we usually wake up either in the middle of the night, usually about 3 o'clock, or we're anxious in the morning. It's because cortisol levels start to rise at those times. So as much sleep as you can get in before midnight is helpful, because that's when you get your best restful sleep. So not going to bed too late. If you find you're waking up in the middle of the night as well with anxiety, just a simple thing is make sure you have very small amount of slow release carbohydrates and good fat before you go to bed. So for example, an oat cake with a little bit of peanut butter or hummus, that actually will help regulate your blood sugar, which gets thrown out with cortisol. And then when it dips, that also makes sure that you're awake at that time in the morning. So something as simple as having something small to eat, having a wind down routine as well in the evening can help. Having a bath, making sure that you don't expose yourself to loads of media, to stimulants in the evening. In terms of a morning routine, I actually have one of my points. The last one is about creating a routine. So we're going to talk about that. But humans do really well with a routine. And leaping out of bed and going straight into the rush of the day is one of the worst things you can do for anxiety. So just taking 5 minutes to have a herbal tea, to breathe, to journal, to think about those few things you have to do for the day actually go a long way to moderating those cortisol levels. And we're going to talk about that shortly. So thank you for that one. Zach, can we go to the results of the poll, please?
Yes, of course I can. And so I'm sharing that. We had a low percentage, 1% saying none, 12% said a couple of minutes, 36% said under an hour, 32% said 1 to 2 hours, and around 18% said over 2 hours. So most of our results are sort of sitting in that under an hour, or an hour and 2 hours, in between that sort of.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you for that. Though it's also that's kind of 80%, nearly 80% though is over an hour, or in that getting to a serious amount of exposure to media. So just take a moment to think whether that is helpful and needed for your job. Some people, as I say, is, but even the most, watching the markets or something like that, you need to watch the market. You don't necessarily have to be exposed to the whole gamut of personal interest stories as well. So take a real hard look about that and see if you can actually limit it to the bare minimum that you need. But again, thank you so much for sharing that. I think it's a really important one. So number 3, limit exposure to the media and social media as much as you can. Let's go on to self-care tip number 4. So we're still in the behavioural space. We'll go on and talk about more about the sort of nutrition and everyday things you can do in a moment. But from a behavioural point of view, this sounds a little bit sort of, Mr. Spock from Star Trek, become a creature of reason. But I've worded it particularly like this because sometimes we get really at the mercy of our emotions, and we have to feel our emotions. They're important. We need to feel them. We don't need to suppress them. But they can be unreliable. Our emotions can send us signals, as we heard before, thinking about how the limbic system and the amygdala works. They can send us a hyperactive response that is not always in kilter with the stimulus or the thing that's actually coming in. And one of the first things that is really important to do is be aware of what the conditions present actually are. This is where mindfulness comes in. It's actually about being in the moment. So I'm one of my mind-body disciplines is called the Alexander technique, and we actually have a mental discipline called analyze conditions present. And I love that because it's not conditions past, it's not conditions future. Your conditions right here, right now. What is actually happening? What is a reasoned response in this particular moment? And that takes mental discipline to think, stop. A stimulus has come in. I've seen a depressing or distressing story, or I've had a thought about something, or I'm worried about something. Creating a mental stop and then a gap between the stimulus coming in and your response, a gap to breathe, because otherwise we respond in this old habitual way. And our response is always going to be one of 3 things. The old response, the rise in anxiety, the habitual quick response, can be a new way, or it can be no response at all. So there's always going to be one of those 3, and those 3 need to become choices. So it feels artificial, but it's actually again about creating those neural pathways and strengthening the neural pathways. So ask yourself, what are the conditions present? What's happening right at this moment? Not now in the generic, what's happening now? There are wars, there's pandemics. What are the conditions right now? Right now, we are sitting here on a webinar. Your conditions present will be different from the next person, but we're all here right now. This is the moment. And the gap, the stimulus coming in and responding to it becomes a choice. And this is the stuff that over the last 10 years, I think has really saved me from becoming extremely anxious and probably having a breakdown, is looking after myself and fueling and be healthy and training as a personal trainer and as an accredited coach and doing all this wonderful mind-body stuff, but really learning to understand my responses and understanding what's a real stimulus coming in, what the real conditions are, and can I have a practical plan to address it? If I can, great, put it into action. If not, it's an acceptance of I'm in my circle of influence, that's all I can do. I have to step outside the excessive concerns. And this last sentence here, which is a reason-led person, understands themselves, they understand their responses and how to analyze them, put their needs first, they take care of themselves while bringing perspective. This is what I'm talking about when I'm talking about almost kicking our thinking up a gear on the evolutionary ladder. And it's worth actually having this as a personal goal, is to understand how reason and rationale sit alongside your emotional responses. There's some things on the reference slide that I've included that really help on this. There's some work on the language of emotions and about how we respond to things. So have a look at that after the webinar as well. But I'm going to move on more from this behavioural side to talk about looking after ourselves with the basics. And the first one is, in times of instability, uncertainty, we need to fuel ourselves properly. Good nutrition is a webinar in its own right. And we all know, I think, that we all need to be eating lots of fruit and veg and good carbohydrates and less sugar and all of that kind of thing. So I'm not going to patronise you by going through the nutrition basics. But when we're talking about running on adrenaline and responding to something, these are the things we need to be talking about, because we now know from the research that there's a really strong link between poor nutrition and increased anxiety levels. The gut's been called the second brain, and research has found cells which are almost akin to our neuron cells in the gut. And there's this huge link between healthy and good gut bacteria and mental health. So at the very least, this is something we can do. We can actually do something about this, even if we can't do anything about the external events. So make sure on a daily basis that you're feeding your gut bacteria. And there's several ways to do this. Fermented foods are the best way to do it. I've listed a few here, things like sauerkraut, kefir, misos, kimchi. They're all really good. Sprouting foods, sprouting seeds and so on. They're good for feeding gut bacteria. And you can also take probiotics or prebiotics as well, if you're not getting enough of these in your diet. Unfortunately, wine does not count as a fermented food in this, or beer, but make sure you're actively putting fermented foods into your diet. The other thing to think about is lots and lots of phytonutrients. So these are your bright coloured foods, your red peppers, your carrots, your green leafy veg, your everything that's a different colour, your tomatoes, anything that's got this bright colour, cabbages and so on. The colour is caused by what's called phytonutrients, and they give us the nutrient hit we need. Because if we're nutrient deficient, we're going to be tired, we're going to be burnt out, we're going to be more anxious, especially things like vitamin B, C and D. Those of us who are in the northern hemisphere this time of year are going to be vitamin D deficient, and we feel low, we feel tired when we don't have enough vitamin D. So think about having that as a supplement, because we get it through sunlight, and at the moment, if you're in the northern hemisphere, you're not going to get that so much. I mentioned here magnesium, zinc and iron. Magnesium has a huge link with sleep. So if you're struggling with sleep and anxiety, and we had a question about that earlier, magnesium is the thing to have before bed, because low magnesium levels disrupt sleep. So make sure you're getting enough of that in your diet as well. So making sure that you have that diet that is low in processed foods, it's low in sugar, that you've got your complex carbohydrates, which is your brown rice, your brown pasta, brown bread, rather than white rice, pasta and bread, limiting caffeine, limiting alcohol. That is at least the bare minimum of fuel that you can feed your gut and feed your brain on. Bear in mind, just before I move on from this, alcohol is a depressant and can increase anxiety as well. So think about how much alcohol you actually have on a daily basis as well, because the next day it can cause a significantly increase in anxiety. So just on the subject of fueling yourself as well, I call this slide Nourish Your Neurotransmitters, because I don't think we think sometimes about food as helping our brain chemistry. There are 3 neurotransmitters that are really important: dopamine, serotonin and oxytocin. Make sure on a daily basis you're having enough foods to feed your dopamine and serotonin, because low levels of these are going to undermine your resilience and your ability to cope with external stresses. It's really hard to put into action all the behavioural stuff we've spoken about if the tank is low and you're running on poor quality food. So these are your good fats, your nuts and seeds come in everywhere in terms of good nutrients. Nuts, seeds, things like your lean proteins, foods with tryptophan in, and I've listed a few here. Tryptophan is actually converted into serotonin in the brain. You know, it's not so simple as, oh, eat a bit of chicken if you're feeling anxious and it ups your serotonin. But if your serotonin levels are low, then why not make sure you're feeding lots of tryptophan to actually help your serotonin levels? So you know, there's an element here of, we all know we need to be eating well, but this is why, for mental health and for dealing with uncertainty. And the final one here is oxytocin, and that is about actually reaching out to others. It's called the love hormone. Talking to people, meeting, touch, massage, meditation, stroking a pet, the cat comes in again, you know, those sorts of things, they all stimulate oxytocin and make us feel better. So that's the stuff around fueling yourself properly. These slides will all be available after the webinar, so you can go back to these as a reference point, but make sure as a basic, on a daily basis, you are getting those things in. Number 6, movement. I'm not going to spend much time on this because we all know we need to exercise, but I just want to emphasize again, if you're really struggling to deal with what is happening in the world at the moment, things that are out of your control, make sure you are doing something on a daily basis to move, because we are made to move in terms of getting our circulation going, burning off the stress chemicals and so on. And this encourages neuroplasticity. So if we're looking at getting those good neurons firing and we're trying to build new pathways, even just going for a walk helps. I love the fact that movement, we can see it as this mindfulness in 3D. It is, it's being there and present in movement. And start small if you don't do very much, even if it's just stretching and so on. And I've added in the reference section the World Health Organization exercise goals and some resources on that. So don't forget your movement. Even if you're feeling exhausted and tired and overwhelmed, don't underestimate just the power of a 10-minute walk around the block. So that's all I want to say on movement, but it's a really important point because it will feed into everything else. Now, number 7 is something that on a daily basis is going to guaranteed help deal with overwhelm. If you're looking at how do I deal with all the stuff I can't control. And it's about activating your parasympathetic nervous system. This is the bit of your nervous system that brings everything down. It brings your heart rate down. It brings your breathing down. It calms everything down. And there's something called the vagus nerve that runs all the way from your head, all the way down through your torso. Interestingly enough, also goes into the gut. And having good vagal tone helps your parasympathetic nervous system. Now, interestingly, poor vagal tone can actually be inherited. So if you've had a parent, for example, who's been in a war zone, or a parent who's gone through starvation or something like that, sometimes they can pass on poor vagal tone. So it's important to actually do things that activate your vagus nerve. And I've given you a list here of daily activities that will activate your vagus nerve. And this is often why people go on about doing yoga and Pilates and Tai Chi and gentle exercise and walking, because actually they activate the vagus nerve. Now, I don't like yoga particularly, and I'm very tired of people always saying, oh, yoga's the answer. It is brilliant if that's your thing. I love Tai Chi, that works for me. So find the thing that works for you. But even if you don't do any of those, something as simple as lying down on your back, breathing from your diaphragm with your knees bent, it's called lying in semi-supine, it puts pressure on the vagus nerve and it activates it, and it activates the parasympathetic nervous system. So even 2 to 5 minutes in semi-supine or meditating on a daily basis will help that neuroplasticity, and it will help bring everything down. Interestingly, things that actually are up here in the throat, singing, gargling, tapping, they activate it as well. And there's some great stuff online about vagus nerve activation and exercises. So I really encourage you on every day to do, even if it's a few minutes, activation of your parasympathetic nervous system. And let's just go into the last one. Came up earlier about creating a clear routine. Now, we're here to talk about an unstable world, uncertainty. One of the best things you can do to deal with uncertainty is create structure around your own life. And again, it seems like a basic point, but I think a lot of us don't do this. We have a rushed routine during the week, and then we're so exhausted at the weekend, we just lie there and have a lie-in, and then we pull ourselves out, we do some chores and we go to bed again. Whereas actually we work best having a routine that is the same 7 days a week, going to bed, getting up at the same time. And it helps make sense of uncertainty mentally and physically. So develop a clear routine in the morning that works for you. Some people love exercising in the morning, others don't. I hate exercising in the morning, which when I was a personal trainer years ago was a nightmare because everyone wanted to train in the morning. I prefer to do it at lunchtime. Whereas my morning, I like to get up, sit there with a tea, I have my 10 minutes checking the news, I do some breathing exercises, I go outside if I can, I have breakfast, look at the things I have to do for the day, and then ease into it. It's having that routine that works for you so that you are at least covering the basics that work for your schedule. So I'm not here to tell you the perfect routine, but it's actually working out those 3 or 4 steps. Maybe that's the time in the evening you do your 5 minutes vagal tone work, your parasympathetic nervous system, or you take 10 minutes to food prep for the week. On a Sunday, I actually like to stick on Netflix or something in the kitchen, watch some comedy show and batch cook and make loads of casseroles with lots of bright coloured vegetables in, stick it all in the freezer for the week so I don't have to think about it. So there is an element of planning and preparing and diarising to create your own routine rather than being at the mercy of everything else. Also, what's helpful here, if you're worried about others, have a time a day to check in as well, rather than constantly exchanging messages and constantly being reactionary. I think also it manages other people's expectations around us. So for example, you know, my mother, she's elderly now, worries, likes to check in. I now manage her expectations by saying, at 5 o'clock I'll phone you. I've only got 10 minutes, but it'd be really nice to talk to you then. We've got 10 minutes. So it's managing her expectation that we get to speak, but that I've got to go into a meeting and it'll only be a short call. But it then helps her structure and it helps her to feel more certain as well. Just be really careful here of micromanaging everything, because it's really easy to go into diarise and planning over mode. So make sure that you are flexible with your plan and you're not managing others, but just creating that structure that works for you. So that is our quick tour through the plan to introduce some basic self-care things on a daily basis and some behavioural changes to help us all deal with this nightmare of a world that is here at the moment. It's really, really tough, but actually we don't have to be at the mercy of it. So if you don't do anything else from today, take a couple of those points, see what you can do with those and make some positive changes in your life. As I mentioned, there's a resources sheet after this. You'll get a copy of the pack. But we've got just about 10 minutes or just under 10 minutes before we close. So what I'd really like to do is hand over to you. Zach, if you could feed some questions through and I'll take those now.
Yeah, so we've got quite a few to go through. So the first one is, how do you avoid stress from close relations who can't be avoided?
Yeah, that's a really tough one. If it's someone you don't live with, I think the managing time on a daily basis helps. But you have to be really clear about your boundaries of saying, I will phone you at such and such a time, and I'm afraid I really want to talk to you. I'm worried about you, want to hear from you, but I've only got 15 minutes, so let's talk then. And being very clear that that is the time that you have to speak with them. If you're living with someone, it's really hard because it's easy to take on their stress and their worry as well. And again, it's almost you have to sit down together and almost allocate a time to worry. It sounds again very formulaic, but if you're worried about an external event, it's, well, let's sit down for 15 minutes and just talk about our worries, and then we're going to talk about something else. When my partner and I were going through an incredibly stressful external event where we were at the mercy of somebody else, and it was a great injustice that was going on, it nearly drove both of us crazy. And the only way we could deal with it, rather than feeding each other's fears all the time, was to say, we are going to sit here and talk about it for 20 minutes, and then we're going to do something else. And we had to agree that between ourselves. So I would certainly recommend, if you are able to do that, to put boundaries in place, such as those. But thank you, great question. Zach, have we got another one coming through?
Yes, there's quite a few actually. So how do you currently deal with guilt in relation to circumstances that are beyond your control?
Okay, it's a good question. However, I'm going to answer it with a question back, which is it fair on yourself to feel guilt about something you haven't done? We all feel guilty about things that people we know may have done, or our government has done, or our friends have done. But actually, if we think about it, it just is not rational to feel guilty about something that we have no influence on or no impact on at all. So it's reminding yourself that that's within your sphere of concern and not influence, and that you haven't done anything wrong and there is nothing to feel guilty about. And reminding yourself constantly, isn't it silly to feel guilty about something I haven't done? Why do I feel like that? Because actually I can't do anything about it. The guilt is not mine. But it has to be articulated and really thought about. Even draw it out, draw a big circle, influence, concern, put little points and go, oh, that's where that sits. Okay, I get that. So take the pressure off yourself with that. It's all I can say. It's a really difficult one, because I think we all do it to a certain extent. Any more?
Yes, this one might be slightly specific, but it says a family member is constantly listening to the radio out of fear of an attack. For them, no news is good, is some sort of good news, but I can't tell if it's actually good for their health. Do you believe that there's any other ways to reduce the screen or listening time on the radio, etc.?
Well, I would go back to what I was saying, that constant drip, drip, drip is going to be increasing stress hormones. And there are things that are happening where people are going to be exposed to a very real danger. So there has to be an understanding, right, how much does that person need to be exposed to keep themselves physically safe? But a constant stream of it is going to be bringing their stress hormones up and their stress chemicals up considerably on a daily basis. So I think there's a conversation about what's the bare minimum that's required to stay physically safe, not mentally safe, because they may feel mentally safe, they need to listen all the time. But I'm aware some people might be in a position where they need to actually look after their physical safety, and that's not for me to dictate how they feel they need to look after that. But certainly I think it's getting down to that minimum information versus safety ratio, essentially.
Another one in relation to technology that says, I am unable to get to sleep without the television on. How do I break this habit without taking melatonin?
Well, melatonin's not always the answer, actually. Doesn't work for everybody, to be fair, and sleeping tablets don't work for everyone. So I think it's not a one or the other. But yeah, I've certainly known a lot of people who need something in the background in order to fall asleep, and it's simply become habitual. What I would recommend is trying to swap. Firstly, take it in small increments. Swap the television for some other form of media. So with the TV, you've got both visual input and audio input. Swap it for something that is purely audio input, say the radio. Put it on a radio station that is simply something neutral, such as classical music, for example, or a radio play, something that is not going to be stimulating you as you fall asleep, and then gently wean yourself off that. And actually, I don't see, if it's something that's fairly neutral and something such as classical music, I don't see anything wrong necessarily with using that to fall asleep. But I think you need to look at the small increments and what it is that you have on the television. So if you have news on the television, for example, swap to a different channel. After a couple of weeks, swap to the radio, swap to something else, and then build yourself into weaning yourself off a bit slowly. But thank you for that question, and good luck with that, because it is difficult when you've got that ingrained habit. We've got about 3 minutes left, Zach. Any kind of common themes coming through that I can answer some questions on before we close?
Yes, of course. So someone's actually put a comment here. that there seems to be 50 different type of things that we need to do to actually have a positive mental health. But is there one message or one thing that you can say that may boost their or develop their positive mental attitude in general, rather than focusing on loads of these little things? Is there one thing in particular that you should really go for?
Okay, if someone said if there's one sort of behavioural, mental and one physical thing to do, physically I'd say get out for 10 minutes a day and go for a walk in the fresh air, breathe. Number one. If you don't do anything else for your physical and mental health, get outside and breathe the fresh air and allow yourself to bring yourself down that way. The only other thing behaviourally is this: understand what is your influence and what is your worry. So what can you control, what can you not control, and try and have a mental stop between your response when something comes in. And it's literally that one point, and that will immediately start creating improved behavioral side of things. So it's just, where are you? What is your things you can control right now, and can you stop the old habitual response? But it's a tough one, yes, because there's lots of things we can do, and that's why this is a bit of a toolkit. I always think of all of these things as tools in your toolkit to take that next best smallest step forward, and you are the best person to put that together to create your personal toolkit. So these are all things that you can draw on in times of need. Thank you so much for that question, Zach. I think we've got 1 minute, maybe we've got time for one more question before we close.
Yes, of course. So what is your technique to balance helping so many who are in need currently? And do you have any book recommendations as well? Sorry, it was actually two parts of the same question.
Book recommendations, resources sheet. Things about when you're tired but wired, love that. There's one about creating a morning routine. There's some stuff around understanding emotions, about embracing uncertainty, some neurology stuff in there. So there's some book recommendations. In terms of personal action, I do what I can in things that concern me the most, in terms of whether it be supporting the friend who's most in need, but I try and do something practical. I've got friends in need at the moment, and it might just something be as practical as sharing food. Is what can you actually do? But I think this is part of our own personal toolkit, because it's such a wide question and such a personal thing that comes from our own values and beliefs. And I think just recognizing that we're all coming from a different place, but we're all in a global community that really has challenges at the moment, and just supporting each other as much as we can, I think, is really important. And on that note, I think we've run out of time. So thank you so much, everybody, for joining us today. And Zach, I'll just hand over to you to close, please.
Of course, thank you very much for the session there, Lindsay. I just want to thank you for obviously giving that out to us today. Just a reminder that this session was recorded, and the slides and the recording will be sent to yourself once the presentation finishes. It does sometimes take a little bit longer to go out to you. Thank you so much for your engagement and your questions. We're hoping that we have answered everything that was possible during the process. But for now, I hope everybody has a lovely rest of their day. And thank you very much for joining. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.